Hello, my name's Sharon Bessell. I'm from the Crawford School at the Australian National University. I'm sorry that I couldn't be at the conference, which I was looking forward to very much, but I'm grateful to Nigel for giving me the opportunity to share some ideas with you via video. My email address was on the beginning of this presentation, so please feel free to provide feedback and comments and engage in a conversation that way if you'd like to. This presentation is called When Children Are Asked About Their Communities. The research is funded by the Australian Research Council and it's been undertaken in collaboration with two leading non-government organisations in Australia. NAPCAN, which is an organisation that works for the end of child abuse and neglect and to prevent child abuse and neglect, and the Benevolent Society, which is Australia's oldest charity, 200 years old next year, which provides services into disadvantaged communities. I've been doing this research in collaboration with Professor Jan Mason from the University of Western Sydney. The catalyst for this research is the focus on social inclusion and on community strengthening that has become part of the Australian policy and service landscape over the past 6 or 7 years. Within policies aimed at promoting social inclusion and at strengthening communities, children are often seen as beneficiaries whose lives will be improved as a result of an inclusive society, or as catalysts for bringing together adults. For example, early childhood programs are often seen as having at least one role to play in connecting adults, particularly in disadvantaged communities. And in this research, we're not suggesting that those kinds of policies don't have the potential to either improve children's lives or to bring adults together. However, we're interested where children fit in communities as active members of a community. Within policies and often within services, children as people or as full members of society tend not to feature very prominently. Children are often expected to benefit but are incidental to community strengthening and social inclusion policies. So in this research, we want to explore firstly how children define community, what children value about their communities, what children would like to change about their communities, and the ways in which children contribute to their communities. Our main research question is what would make community strengthening and social inclusion policies and programs genuinely child responsive and child inclusive? And we use the terms child responsive and child inclusive quite purposefully. Often the term child-centred is used, at least within the Australian context. In many instances, our aim should be to be child-centred. But when we're thinking broadly about communities, it may not always be children who are at the centre of services or at policies. There may be other groups that, for good reason, we wish to place at the centre. However, the idea underpinning this research is that children should always be included in the conceptualisation of policies and services and included when those services and policies are implemented. And children should be included in discussions about what's working and what isn't. We always need to be responsive to children as key members of the society, even when we're not placing children at the centre. The research that I'm talking about here is ongoing, and we hope to have completed all of the research with children by the end of the year. So far, 89 children have participated in this research, 57 girls and 32 boys between the ages of 7 and 12 years. Those children have come from 5 different geographical communities across 3 states and territories in Australia. We've also had 29 adults participating in the research. In the research with children, we've used a range of methods, including group discussions led by children, one-on-one discussions, or research chats, as we've called them, community mapping, poster making, and feedback sessions. Our methodology has aimed to ensure that children feel comfortable in engaging in the research, in sharing their views, and in either participating or withdrawing as they want to. And our methodology has aimed to ensure that children are able to shape both the methods that are used but also the nature of the conversations that we've had. And the children have been able to add important questions that we need to explore. What I'm going to present today are some of the common themes that have emerged so far across all of the groups of children who have been involved in the research. We have had some outliers in terms of our findings, but it's the common themes that I want to focus on today. In designing this research, we had very lengthy discussions about how we as researchers should best define community. It became very clear that it was not appropriate, particularly given our commitment to participatory methodologies, for us to define community. Rather, we needed to ask children, as the starting point for the research, how they think about community, how they think community should be defined. And so, how do children define this sometimes amorphous thing called community? Vincent, who is 10, captured the view of many children when he said, "Community is a place where people come together and have fun." The idea of community being about both people and place was very important, not one or the other. I just add here that the majority of children did not define online communities as being the same as their physical community. Some children did engage in various kinds of online community, but they saw that as being quite different. That's perhaps another paper, but it was place and people with whom they had a connection that formed the basis of children's definition of community. And just a reminder that these children were aged between about 7 and 12. So the importance of online communities may change for older children. It's a question. For the children involved in this research, people were most important in making community. It was people and relationships with people who were absolutely central to their definition of community. But places were still very significant. In discussing Vincent's definition, Santo, who was 11, brought another perspective. He agreed about people and place, but he said the communities don't always need to be about fun. There can still be community, he said, when people are sad or when bad things are happening and people need help or support. And indeed, a number of children said that that was when community was most important, when things weren't fun but were bad. But still, people and place remained important. For most of the children involved in this research, their families were central to their definition and their experiences of community. Families, and particularly parents, facilitated the ways in which children were able to be involved in their communities. One girl, who is 10, said that she would like her parents to be much more active in their community. Her neighbours, she said, were very active in a whole range of community activities that took place. She really wanted to be part of those community activities, but her parents didn't engage in them. They didn't have time, they explained to her, and she said she thought that they weren't really all that interested. But because her parents weren't involved, she wasn't able to be involved either, and this was something she regretted. She wanted more active participation in her community, but wasn't able to act on that herself. So, what do children value about their communities? Among the things the children value about their communities, 3 things have emerged as being particularly important. Those 3 things are safety, time with parents, and places to go and celebrations. So first, to think a little bit about what children said about safety in their communities. Feeling safe within their local communities was very, very important to children. Almost all of the children who were involved in this research identified or talked about the issue of safety. Children were quite mixed in terms of how safe they feel within their communities, and feelings of safety varied between the communities that we were working in. In communities where children experienced or witnessed antisocial behaviour, particularly antisocial behaviour on the part of adults, drunkenness, or what they described as scary behaviour from adults. They were very unlikely to feel safe. Disturbingly, in a number of communities, children talked about regularly witnessing these kinds of behaviours. And when children talked about, for example, drunken behaviour, some children talked about those behaviours within their family, but most of them talked about community-level drunkenness. They also talked about the ways in which their parents would often try to protect them from drunken behaviour. In one research site, just to develop this idea of scary people in communities making children feel unsafe, all of the children involved in the research talked about a scary man who often yelled at them if they saw him in the street or in the park. And this man sometimes jumped out at them as they walked past, jumped out from behind a building or behind a tree. When we talked to adults in the community about this man, they said that he's very well known locally, that he's a rather sad character, he has mental health issues and alcohol issues. But, the adults emphasised, he's pretty much harmless. For the children, however, his behaviour was quite threatening and made them feel unsafe and uncertain when they were out in their local communities. In this particular community, the school was quite close to the local park, and children would often walk from school to the park or from school to the local library. And this particular man was often around the library or the park. So it had quite a marked impact on the way in which they felt they could engage in their communities. Children also talked a great deal about hearing stories of strangers approaching children, of stranger danger, as it's often termed. And these stories made them feel very unsafe, even when they had not experienced any problems with strangers themselves. But these stories had a life of their own, and most children had heard stories about children being approached or abducted by adults, even when they and their friends had no experience of that. In some cases, however, it's adults, and particularly parents' concerns about safety that's the key issue. In one research site, children talked about feeling generally safe in their communities, but of not being allowed to go to the park alone or to walk around their communities themselves because of their parents' concerns about their safety. And this, of course, plays into this issue of stranger danger. Ellen, who was 12, summed it up when she said, "My mum is very protective of me and she just doesn't let me go into the street that we live on. It's really very annoying." It's important to note here that there is considerable pressure on parents in the Australian context to monitor their children's movement. And there have been a couple of quite well publicised recent cases where parents have been charged for leaving children of around 9 or 10 years, either alone at home alone or alone in cars. And so parents often feel they don't have the choice to allow their children to actively engage in their communities on their own. So children value safety, but there are lots of layers and complex issues here that relate both to children, to their parents' attitudes, but also to the social context, which in Australia, and I think in many other countries as well, prevents children from being out alone in public spaces. Children's lives have become very much domesticated and institutionalised. A very strong theme that emerged from the research was that children felt safer when they know people within their communities. So John, who is 11, said, "I feel very safe in my community because I know my community. I know the people very well, and I know that they'll never hurt me or do anything bad. For example, there's no strangers in our community. I know my whole community, so it's okay. I ride my bike sometimes and I just say hi to my neighbours." And John and some of the other children who lived near him talked about the fact that if they ever felt unsafe in their community, they knew that there were lots of houses, lots of people that they could go to and ask for help. So familiarity was very important. Time with parents was the second issue that children talked about as being of value to them. As I've already noted, families and parents particularly tend to facilitate children's involvement in their communities. Generally, the children involved in this research felt they had far less time with their parents than they would like, and there were two reasons for this. First, in some families, parents worked very long hours and were either not physically present in their children's lives or were physically present at the end of the day but were too tired or too busy with household chores to do much with their children. And this was the case in both communities that were identified as being disadvantaged and in communities that were identified as being better off. Although in the disadvantaged communities, children tended to be at home alone or at home with their siblings while their parents were at work. And this is despite a social context, where that's strongly discouraged in Australia. In the more advantaged communities, children tend to have very programmed lives. Many of the children involved in this research from better off communities began their day by 8 o'clock with perhaps music lessons or some form of before school care. They then went to school for the entire day. They would then have after school care or activities like sport or ballet or homework clubs, sometimes taking them up till 6 or 7 o'clock at night. So children had very long days but very institutionalised days that gave very little time for engagement with parents. And one of the reasons for this in both types of communities was the extent of parents' working hours. At least that's the way children explained their situations. I think this is interesting, and it's interesting to note here that social inclusion policies in Australia have focused very heavily on engaging adults in productive work or in education. The primary ways within the Australian policy framework that people are included socially is through employment or education. There's been almost no serious consideration in the Australian context of other conceptualisations of social inclusion, including conceptualisations of social inclusion that may be positive for children or that may respond to children's desire to have more time with their families and to do things in their communities with their families. The second issue that emerged when children talked about time with their families was in two research sites, each in areas defined as being of low socioeconomic status, where children talked about parents spending significant amounts of time at the local pub or the local club, often using pokies or gambling machines. In these cases, children either stayed at home alone or with siblings, or went with their parents to the clubs or the pubs, but were left in children's rooms. Now, these children's rooms have been developed by many, particularly clubs in Australia, licensed clubs where there's both drinking and gambling, as a way of including children. So the children are quarantined off from the adults, they're away from the gambling and from the drinking, but they're in a room on their own, specifically for children. When I say on their own, they're with other children. Now, when the children in this research talked about those children's rooms within clubs, they universally described them as being very boring and very unpleasant places. They were places where they felt they'd been parked while their parents could have a good time. They weren't examples of community or community engagement. The third thing the children valued about their communities are fun, safe places to go, particularly parks, and for boys, skate parks, particularly for older boys, the boys aged 11 or 12. But there was a strong feeling amongst the children that while there are lots of places for little children to go, parks for younger children, play equipment for younger children, and while there are lots of places for teenagers to go, including malls and cinemas and to some extent skate parks, there's much less for children in middle childhood, between about 8 and 13. There's much less for those children to do. There are fewer places for those children to go. So one of the things the children talked about in terms of improving their community was the development of spaces where they could go and be safe. And a number of children designed the kinds of spaces that they felt would be appropriate for children of their age. So what do children want to change about their communities? There were a number of issues that emerged here, but two that were particularly important that I want to focus on here. First, children wanted to change antisocial behaviour, particularly drunkenness on the part of adults. And this issue of drunkenness was a dominant theme in 4 of the 5 communities that we've undertaken the research in. In one community, one little boy, Dean, who was 10, talked about a special place. He lived in a beachside community. There was a special place on the promenade by the beach that he loved to go. That was his place in his community. But Dean added, I don't like going there on Anzac Day, on Australia Day, or on the weekends when the sun starts to go down. When we asked why Dean didn't like his special place at those times, he said, because that's when the drunks come out. And there was a pub very close by. Children also wanted an end to dangerous behaviour in cars. And in a number of the communities, children talked about cars speeding and erratic driving. Children said they wanted to be able to ride their bikes, to ride their scooters, or just walk around the streets. But car safety was a major issue for both them and their parents. Essentially, children wanted adult drivers to take account of the fact that these public spaces are used by children as well as by adults in cars. A number of children talked about adults driving past in cars and yelling at them to move off the road if they were on their bikes. And one boy in particular talked about this as indicative of a lack of respect that he felt adults accorded to children in his community. Children also talked about disliking graffiti, although a couple of boys who were aged about 12 put forward the view that, well, actually graffiti's not all that bad. It can be a way of expressing yourself. But generally children, and particularly the younger children, didn't like graffiti, and they didn't like litter, both of which they felt made their communities look ugly and look like hostile places. The second issue that children wanted to change was a less personal, in many ways, and a more macro-social set of issues. Children wanted to overcome inequality and injustice, and there were a lot of discussions around injustice and inequality within their societies, within their communities. A number of children talked about wanting more hospitals to ensure that everyone has access to medical care. And this is in a context of a great deal of debate within the Australian context about the pressures on the public hospital system. Children were aware of these debates and were concerned about it. Children also wanted more police. At least in 3 of the 5 communities, this was a strong theme. More police to ensure the communities are safe. They also wanted action to end homelessness. And the problem of homelessness was an issue that children talked about a great deal in the context of their communities. Even when they hadn't experienced homelessness themselves, or weren't personally familiar with people who had experienced homelessness, they were aware of this as a social issue and wanted to change it, or wanted it to be changed in their communities. In one research site, a group of children, aged between 9 and 11, raised the problem of high rents and debated amongst themselves whether the government should cap or put a limit on rents to ensure that housing is affordable. One girl involved in that debate shared her personal experiences. She argued that rent should be capped, and she explained that she and her mother and her brothers and sisters sometimes had problems buying food because they just couldn't afford the rent. So for her this was a personal issue. But for the other children who engaged in the debate, it was an issue of social justice that they felt very strongly about. They had diverse views about whether or not rent should be capped. But the discussion, I think, also demonstrates to us the way in which children are able to engage in sophisticated debates that are often considered to be the preserve of adults. So, to conclude, what do the children who participated or have participated so far in this research want their communities to be? They want their communities to be safe, they want to feel safe in their communities, and they want adults to take responsibility for helping to create safe environments. They want fairness and justice. They want adults to act responsibly. And this was a major theme around issues of graffiti, of dangerous driving and of alcohol use. The children felt that it was adults who were acting irresponsibly within their communities. Sometimes that were they were referring to older adolescents. Sometimes they were referring to people who were well and truly within the age category we would refer to as adults. Children wanted their communities to be inclusive regardless of youth and respectful of everyone regardless of youth. But generally they felt that being a child meant that they were not respected and not fully included in their communities. Yet many wanted to be an active part of their communities and to contribute to those communities. What's very interesting here, I think, is that certainly within the Australian context, there are a lot of policies and programs that try to engage adolescents in their communities, in political discussions, and in a whole range of activities that could contribute to strengthening communities. But we have very little that's aimed at engaging younger children, children in middle childhood who are involved in this research. And yet here I think we're missing an opportunity, because in this age group, at least this research has suggested, that children want to be active in their communities, they want to contribute to their communities. To date, policies aiming to foster inclusive societies and to build communities are not facilitating children's desire to be full and respected members of their community. And we're hopeful that this research will provide some very practical ideas about the ways in which children can be respected as full members of their community and how they can be fully included. We hope that this research will contribute in some small way to community strengthening and social inclusion policies and programs, seeing children as citizens and as full members of societies. Thank you.